Good afternoon. I'm Julia Jordan Zachary, and it's truly an honor to be here to serve as the moderator of our closing keynote panel on Intersectionality Research, Practice, Challenges, and Possibilities. And we're going to go in the order listed in the program, starting with Dr. Elizabeth Cole, and I'll offer a brief introduction prior to each presentation. Elizabeth Cole is professor and chair of Women's Studies. She's also a professor of psychology and Afro-American and African studies at the University of Michigan. Her scholarship is rooted theoretically in women's studies and methodologically in psychology, and examines the social construction of categories such as gender, race, and social class through a combination of theoretical and empirical work. Her theoretical papers use feminist and critical race theory to consider how psychology's methods have sometimes obscured understanding of these social categories by treating them as categorical variables rather than as social constructions reflecting inequality and stigma. In her empirical work, Professor Cole's aim is to investigate group differences and similarities using historically specific and culturally grounded conceptualizations of race and gender, with special attention to the ways these social categories depend on one another for meaning and are jointly associated with outcomes. I present to you Dr. Elizabeth Cole.
Good afternoon. No, I'm good. Okay. I want to start by thanking Elena and everyone at SFU who organized this conference. And yeah. And I also want to thank all the presenters that have come before me and that have shared their experiences and wisdom. I think it's a privilege to get to speak last at the end of this incredible 3 days and to talk about an agenda for the future. And it's also kind of an intimidating challenge. And thanks to all that I've learned in the last 3 days, last night I went back to my room and largely rewrote my talk. So you'll see that some of the things I have today are informed by the conversations we've been having. Now, yesterday, when Jessica asked us to turn to the person next to us and tell our partner what we're not sorry about, I told her that I'm not sorry to come from a family that was disrupted by violence and alcoholism. And what she didn't really say is I think that coming to not be sorry for who we are is a journey, and I'm working on that journey, so I chose to share it with her, and now I'm sharing it with you. But the reason I wanted to mention this is that it was this autobiographical experience, what I consider a real land problem, to use Jessica's language, that led me to want to study psychology in the 1980s with the goal of being a clinician, because I wanted to understand this and I wanted to change it for people and families. But when I got there, I found a field that in the mainstream wasn't interested in my understandings of why there was alcoholism and violence in my family. Racism and patriarchy, and they didn't want to know the barriers that kept my mother from leaving, like gender segregations and occupations that led her to wonder if she could support her family on her own. And in fact, when I went into my clinical practicum, I had a supervisor who directed me to tell a client who was in a really similar situation to my mother's that the reason that she didn't want to come twice a week was because she was resisting treatment, not because she had to hide money from her abusive partner to afford treatment. So that real material, that real land problem, my supervisor called resistance. It was so discrepant with my view of the world that I almost left my program. In fact, I did leave the clinical program. And later, I'll talk about why I stayed. But it was in a course called Scholarship of Women of Color that I took in 1988 that first made me think I could have a meaningful life as an academic, that the kind of things I wanted to do in the world I could do within the academy. And the reason that I'm telling this story is because for me, who's chosen a career as an academic, and I think for many of us, this isn't just a theoretical discussion, even though we use the language of theory to talk about it. Oh, I forgot I'm using PowerPoint. And where did it go? Oh, okay. I'm not even called up. Well, if you saw my title on the screen before I got started, it was a little cryptic, and in a couple of slides I'm going to explain it to you. But anyway, so the first slide that after the title that we're going to call up.
I just don't have a mouse function here.
I'm going to keep talking. The first slide, the title says Traveling Theory with a question mark, because intersectionality, the term, if not always the idea, has famously traveled, and it is now called by some people the signal contribution of women's studies. And the reason I want to mention this is that when we talk about how intersectionality's traveled, we talk about it as though it's kind of obvious to everyone today. But I think it's not at all obvious that it's traveled when you pick up a psychology journal, and I think the same is true for other social sciences. So my colleagues Cortina, Curtin, and Stewart recently did a content analysis of specialty journals in psychology that were focused on race and gender. And what they wanted to know is how often do psychology journals even mention the race and gender of their participants, which wasn't as often as you might think, even though our standards within APA say that you ought to mention these things. They also looked at another variable which I think is more important to our conversation about intersectionality. They looked at how often race and gender were theorized, meaning rather than just talking about that as a property of individuals, they talked about why should this matter. And sadly, what they found was that articles in gender-focused psychology journals rarely theorized race, and articles in race and ethnicity-focused psychology journals rarely theorized gender. So we've been talking a lot about intersectionality as something that gets mentioned but not really employed. Even the categories that are so central to intersectionality within my discipline, psychology, get used fairly rarely. And I would argue that the impact of this is that despite the remarkable growth of vibrant scholarly journals addressing race and gender, those who live their lives at the intersection of these two categories in marginalized positions are still overlooked more often than not. So I think it's easy to overstate the extent to which this theory has traveled. And that brings me to the reason for the title of my talk. So I was thinking that getting to go last, what I wanted to do was sort of talk in a big picture way and leave you with some images that might stay with you. One of the themes that's come up over the past few days is that even as we want the idea to be of intersectionality to be taken up, we often have reservations about the ways it is done so. And what I want to do is talk about one way to think about this worry. I think it's useful to come back to Crenshaw's original metaphor. We've often been talking about getting on beyond that metaphor and thinking about it in new ways, but I feel like the implications of that metaphor still have not been completely mined. So we all know that she was talking about racism and sexism and the laws that are supposed to redress them and do so insufficiently as being like traffic, right? And so there's cars going on, there's traffic on these roads, and if someone is injured in the intersection between these roads, how do we know whether it was race or whether it was gender? Now, I think that that metaphor has two implications or two kind of things we could take from it. It has travel built into it innately, which I think is really interesting, and it's implying that there's danger in travel. And I think I want to take up both of those ideas a little bit. Thinking about that, it made me think of another metaphor by implication, and that's the various travel guidebooks that were written for African Americans in the early part of the 20th century. So around the 1930s, when Henry Ford, who's from Detroit, which is near where I'm from, started mass producing the automobile in ways that made it more affordable to more people, some African Americans started having access to cars and being able to travel, and travel was represented as something that was sort of a right of citizenship, and also sort of a marker that African Americans were having new access to leisure and mobility. But that access was severely limited because institutionalized segregation meant that travel was dangerous for African Americans on the road. So Green started writing a book in the 30s that he called the Negro Motorist's Green Book, and there was a new one every year. And what was in the book was tips about how to travel. Things you could, one of the tips that he talked about was that African American motorists should carry a chauffeur's cap so that if they ever got stopped and asked what they were doing, they could say they were a driver for a white person. There were lists in every state and every city of places that you could go and find safe lodging or restaurants or beauty or barber shops. So there were sort of nodes of safety that were pointed out. And there were also risks that were pointed out. So there were certain towns that were known as sundown towns where you didn't want to be after dark. And this book came out every year and was updated. And the guidebook typically said things like, don't travel without this book. And I have a picture of one of the editions here. I think it's an interesting sort of extension of Crenshaw's metaphor, because as we're thinking about how to take intersectionality out into the world, we want to think about how can it travel safely and maintain its integrity. And so I want to talk to you about what I see as some of the risks of that travel. And then I feel like as an academic, it's often easy to see the negatives without the positives. And I feel like this metaphor makes me think about what are the tips as well. Okay, what if we started a green book for intersectionality studies? I'm not going to try to define this comprehensively, but I just want to share some of the things that I notice when thinking about the problem using this analogy. Okay, so let's talk about some of the risks. Some of the risks are methodological and disciplinary, and I feel like we've talked about them multiple times. I don't want to spend too much time on them, but since they're important, I want to mention them again. If you haven't read it before, Kathleen Guidroz and Michelle Berger have written a book on, they've edited a book on intersectionality, and one of the priceless things in that book is an interview with Kim Crenshaw, Michelle Fine, and Neera Yuval Davis, where they're asked about how they came into this field and what they see as the future. And one theme that emerged and that was commented on by all three was what Michelle Fine called a flattening of intersectionality. And by this she meant that it was a description rather than an explanation of group differences, and I feel like that's one of the risks we run when we talk about disparities. That's describing, it's not telling us how the traffic's working on those roads. Another example or a risk of flattening intersectionality is the specter of endlessly multiplying identity categories, which Crenshaw talked about in this interview. I think that's a good kind of cautionary tale for the person who wanted us to talk in this session about, do we lose the fidelity of the concept if we try to invoke kind of every level of disadvantage and disability, disadvantage and identity and difference? I think what intersectionality asks us to do is think about the historical and contextual specificity, and when we try to cover everything, we lose that. Oh, sorry, I just had a little thing up here. Okay. Another thing that they talked about was the risk of, once we start to think of intersectionality like a grid of multiple identities, we could come to treat all those groups like they're equivalent, and that can lead us into problematic kind of models based on addition and subtraction, like do you have two privileges or do you have a privilege plus a disadvantage? And I think a great example of this that I want to mention, because it also gets back to this, the risks of travel, comes from Chang and Culp, who talked about the example of Emmett Till, who, if you know from US history, he was a young African-American boy from the North who was visiting the South in the 1955, and he allegedly whistled at a white woman, and he was later lynched and murdered. If we try to understand what happened to him in terms of having a penalized identity as an African American plus a dominant identity as a male, we fundamentally misunderstood how those categories were working. Now, I don't know if that was a sneeze or a laugh, because that seems sort of a grotesque misunderstanding, but I see papers in psychology that try to translate these categories into simple kind of mathematical categories, and Ange-Marie has written about this. Another thing I see that I think is really insidious is the idea that intersectionality is a hypothesis where you compare different groups, and if they're not different, then intersectionality has been disproven. You know, I don't know. I mean, I guess we laugh so we don't cry. I mean, that seems ridiculous in this room, but we see this going on. And in a little bit, I'm going to talk about what we can do about some of these things. But I want to say that I think these kind of confusions come from not reading original sources. And again, that's not an original thing to say, but it's one of those things that we need to keep saying. Okay, so, sorry about that. So what are some tips to kind of work against that? Well, one is that I think we need to delve deeply into the groups that are invisible at the intersections. And deep means historically contextualized. It means understanding knowledge that's based in that community. We've been talking about this all week, but I think it's important and to remember it's sort of an antidote to some of these negative trends that we see. Another one is to attend to both identity and structure. Intersectional research needs to be concerned primarily with how things work rather than who people are. And I think psychology does that both by being hyper interested in identities and also by loving comparing groups, okay? That really, again, gets us back to descriptions and not explanations. But the other thing is that I feel like another tension that's come up this week is whether intersectionality can ever go out to the disciplines without being kind of distorted and perverted. And I think that's going to be the challenge that we continue to have, but I think it's incredibly crucial. We need to dialogue with the disciplines because otherwise the disciplines are not doing good work. And the disciplines are training most of the students and having a lot of impact in terms of research that they do that affects people's lives. And so we need to keep working with the disciplines. Okay, the next risk I call silencing the insurgent. And if you read the recent article in the Special Science edition by Cho, Crenshaw, and McCall, they talked about two kinds of projects in intersectionality studies. They talked about the centrifugal projects, which basically are the ones that kind of fling intersectionality out to the disciplines. And then they talked about the centripetal projects, but they used this synonym that I like more. They called them insurgent projects that strike out in the margins of their disciplines and are often skeptical about the possibility of integrating mainstream methods and theories. I think that as intersectionality travels, there's kind of a seduction of getting the status and the funding and the recognition that comes with acceptance within the disciplines. And so a lot of times people in my field anyway are talking about how do we do intersectionality within our conventional methods. And I think that there's a role for that, but that it can't be at the expense of doing these more insurgent projects. Disciplinarity carries risks of reinscribing categories when we treat them as variables, and these insurgent projects disrupt that. So some great examples are the work of Lisa Bowleg, who's on our panel. I also want to mention Aronette White, who was an incredible social psychologist who worked on black male feminists. She worked on women revolutionaries in African countries, and she recently passed away, and I worry that with her death she will be less read. These insurgent projects are deeply contextualized using methods based on their subjects and sites, and they're often qualitative, but not always. I'm going to leave that as my tip, and I just got my 5-minute warning, and so I'm going to go ahead a little bit to the last thing I want to say. And this is the risk that I think right now or the past 3 days has been troubling me the most, and that's the risk about questions of ownership. So let me catch up here in my notes. Sorry about this. Okay, I'm having so many technical difficulties today, I'm using someone else's computer, so give me a minute. Okay, well, I'll just talk about it. Okay, yesterday Ange-Marie talked about the issue of intersectionality as intellectual property. And she talked about the legitimate concern that as the theory travels, there's a politics of citation that tends to overlook the original women, often African-American women who initiated this theory. In the initial versions of the theory, African-American women and other women of color were at the center, and what happens when all that drops out. And what Ange-Marie said is that we can't control ownership. Like basically she was saying that train has already left the station. And I think that's really true. So she talked about this in terms of a claim for intellectual property, and she said it's too late for that. But I think that construing this in terms of intellectual property uses the logic of consumerism, and it makes sense that we should think about it this way in these neoliberal times, but that's not the only logic. So I want to propose that another way to think about who owns intersectionality is in terms of stewardship. Okay? Stewardship, according to the dictionary, is the careful and responsible management of something entrusted to one's care. What if we think about ourselves as, if we want to work in intersectionality studies, as having a responsibility to it, to steward it, both to respect the people who brought this to us originally and to preserve it, maintain it, grow it for the students and people that will come after us. And one of the things I like about this metaphor, even though I think it's got a little bit of baggage in terms of faith and financial stewardship, which both are things that make feminists uneasy, but one of the things that I like about it is that it, I just totally lost my train of thought. I like about it because it isn't saying that we have to preserve it unchanged, but we have to be careful and responsible as we grow it, maintain it, and pass it on to the future. And I think 3 ways that we can be good stewards of intersectionality is by reading, and thinking about who we cite, by respecting the coherence of the theory. So we've talked a lot about mentioning and not really invoking, but I heard Vivian May earlier today talk about intersectionality as not like a set of Legos where you can just take the parts you like and then take the ones you don't like and put them back into the bin, right? So it's a coherent theory, and being a good steward of it is recognizing that. Kind of conversely, it also means that it's not infinitely malleable to be stretched to include any kind of intersection of 2 variables, which I also see. And then finally, I think being good stewards means always being mindful of our institutional locations. And I think about that every day in terms of disciplinarity, but one of the things I've learned in this conference is it isn't only an academic project, that when no matter where we're located, we deal with sort of the pressures of the hegemonic norm. So we heard Miki this morning talk about how that happens for people who are creating policy in government organizations. I heard Sobia Sheikh talk yesterday about how that happens for activists in social change groups. So wherever we're located, there's pressures away from a deeply intersectional analysis that thinks about social justice and power, and being a good steward is being mindful of that and always working against that. Okay, I'm probably about at time. I'll say 2 things quickly. 2 areas I want us to think about stewardship are in the process of peer review and in mentoring and teaching. I'm going to argue that when we do peer review, it's a chance to educate editors. It's a chance to speak to our peers when we do peer review. So it's educating often people who are senior to us, people who are our peers, and through mentoring and teaching, we bring up the next generation. So part of being a good steward is thinking about making an intervention at all those levels. And can I read my Audre Lorde quote? And then I'll stop. And so I want to end with, there's always time for Audre Lorde, right? Or maybe not.
Let's see if this works.
Okay. Well, I want to end with a quote by Audre Lorde from The Transformation of Silence into Language and Action. And I feel like that essay most often gets invoked for the quote, your silence will not protect you. But I love this quote, which I actually used in an assignment in my graduate seminar. She said, "What are the words you do not yet have? What do you need to say? Perhaps for some of you here today, I am the face of one of your fears. Because I am woman, because I am black, because I am lesbian, because I am myself, a black woman, warrior, poet doing my work. I come to ask you, are you doing yours?" Now, I feel like when we think of ourselves as stewards, it becomes clear what our work is because we have a responsibility to, and a commitment around social justice to this idea of intersectionality, sharing it with others and passing it on to our students. And I ask my students to write an essay about this question, to think about what questions and commitments motivate their work, what do they hope to learn, who do you see as your intellectual precursors, who are your allies, and to whom do you hold yourself accountable? For some of us, the answers to these questions are linked to our identities as people who are marginalized in different ways, but it doesn't have to be. And I also want to point out that marginalized identities are no guarantee that you will be a responsible steward. That's something we all have to aspire to, hold ourselves to, and hold other people to. But I think that thinking about our work in this way, asking ourselves and our close colleagues if we're doing our work, is a way between intersectionality and intellectual property, between intersectionality's intellectual property and a meme. And I think when we do this, we can be those safe resources along the way to intersectionality. So thank you.
What a powerful, powerful question to end with. Are you doing your work? And are you being a steward of intersectionality? Something to really go home and take from the conference and really ponder and think critically about. Are you doing your work? So next we have Dr. Ruth. Dr. Ruth Zambrana, who is professor in the Department of Women's Studies, director of the Consortium on Race, Gender, and Ethnicity, interim director of the U.S. Latino Studies Initiative at the University of Maryland, College Park, and adjunct professor of family medicine at the University of Maryland, Baltimore, and in the Department of Family Medicine at Maryland University. Dr. Zambrana's work focuses on the intersections of gender, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, and/or contextual variables in health and in higher education disparities. Her emerging scholarship is on inequalities in racial or ethnic women's health and disparity, knowledge production, and public policy. She has co-authored 6 books, including an anthology entitled Emerging Intersections, Race, Class, and Gender in Theory, Policy, and Practice. And her latest book is Latinos in American Society, Families and Communities in Transition. Present Dr. Zambrana.
Thank you. I first want to thank Dr. Hankivsky, not only for this incredible opportunity to share and learn with intersectional scholars, but for her own professional and personal investments in moving the intersectional field forward. I also want to thank Felipe Rodriguez Flores and Gemma Hunting for their attention, support, and assistance. Equally important, I want to thank all of you for your presence here. My remarks today will focus on the challenges of conducting intersectional mixed method study that was funded by the Robert Johnson Foundation. Study is a study of historically underrepresented faculty in research-intensive universities. It's defined as the descendants of involuntary immigrants to the United States via slavery, African Americans, via colonialism, Puerto Ricans, and via force or war, Mexican Americans and Native Americans, American Indians. Regarding the Native American Indian data, I want to say that the data were given to indigenous colleagues at the University of Washington for them to develop and interpret the data. I did not feel, as Dr. Leanne Simpson observed, that I was part of the land or knew the land or the cultural processes of the Native peoples in the United States. I apologize to our Native brothers and sisters here on this land. I am not familiar with the traditions, but I am very grateful that they have passed on to me wisdom and knowledge on their Native values. And I thank Ms. Jessica Danforth, Dr. Simpson, and Dr. Myers for their wisdom. The study on URMs emerged from my own personal observations and witnessing over a 10-year period my own awakening of what appeared to be serious physical and mental health issues among a relatively young cohort of underrepresented minority faculty, and the premature death at ages 42, 56, and suicides in the 40s of young African American, Puerto Rican, Mexican American, and Native American men and women. Further, I all too often listen to very sad and at times heartbreaking stories of exclusion and harsh discriminatory treatment and behaviors across the nation as I went to conferences from these early career scholars I met, and for their request and begging for contact and mentorship that they were not getting in their own universities. So when I started to look at the literature, several autoethnographic descriptive narratives were available in book form. I'm putting this over here, okay. Well, those are the acknowledged. This is the staff that has helped with all the qualitative and quantitative data. As I look back at the literature, there was nothing in the mainstream literature. So of course, it was easy for many of the administrators at the universities throughout to really say, well, I haven't heard that they are suffering. We have lots of blacks here. We have lots of Latinos somewhere in the university here. So when I started to look at the literature, indeed, it was not. Now we're talking about 2010, 2011. It was not there. What I did find, though, was a large number of books and narratives that captured the historical struggles of these academics and their stories, but they were not part of that science. But the titles themselves inform you a bit about their perceptions of their role and their sense of not belonging in the academy. Titles like Integrated but Unequal, Coping with Work-Related Stress, Bittersweet Success, and most recently, Presumed Incompetent, which has captured the attention of many, many URMs throughout the country. So the problem I wanted to address was the low numbers of historically underrepresented faculty in major research-intensive universities, or what we call predominantly white universities. And I wanted to know what in the academic environment, what were the toxins that were contributing to the health and mental health conditions of these groups, and why were they being excluded? I can't figure this out. Do I point over there? Okay. So I want to show you the data. So when we look at the data, we see that they have always been small numbers. If we look back to the 1980s, 1990s, things have not changed very much. But in comparing 2000 to 2010, and these data include all faculty, including lecturer and instructor, you see at the bottom. It also includes international faculty. So the first observation is that from 2000 to 2010, we have seen a decrease in African American faculty. Native American faculty, we have also seen a small decrease. Hispanic Latino faculty, we have seen a slight increase. So why are there so few URM faculty in the academy? So I started this study because although academic life presents barriers to all faculty, URMs experience additional burdens associated with historical experiences, persistent stereotypic representations, and limited economic and social wealth. I think as Ms. Danforth expressed so eloquently yesterday, URM faculty are at risk of racism, colonial moments, as my Native American colleagues call them, imperialism and appropriation of our ideas, and intergenerational trauma of an economic and social legacy of exclusion. So I wanted to capture this. And so this work is a work in progress in trying to apply intersectional theory and intersectional lens to the work. There are some caveats or cautions that I want to offer right now to avoid misunderstanding by non-URM faculty. My work does not in any way diminish the discrimination that non-Hispanic whites or other groups such as Asians and international faculty experience, or their own pain and suffering in accommodating to a university. My study does speak to the disproportionate underrepresentation of historically underrepresented groups who contributed to the development of the great nation of the United States, if you will, and the underuse by this nation, by my nation, of a strong domestic talent pool that is absolutely necessary to the academic health of higher education if they are to contribute to solving the many domestic social issues of inequality and inequity that we face in the United States. This represents the scientific rationale and justification for my study. So this is a conversation about the intersections of race, ethnicity, class, gender, and historical group incorporation, and the social, economic, and psychological consequences of that historical means of incorporation. This is a very sensitive topic in the United States. There is much guilt, pain, and shame surrounding the history of conquest, slavery, and occupation of peoples, of native peoples in American history. Many would rather ignore or overlook these issues that arise from history and not hear or grapple with these stories. In fact, in the United States, there is this talk of diversity fatigue. The diversity fatigue seems to be on the white side, but in truth, it should be on the other side because we are the ones who represent diversity constantly. Because it is hard to face these inequalities, we often refuse to acknowledge that these stories are central to the American experience. They threaten the foundational values of U.S. meritocracy and colorblindness. As a result, we perpetuate what Arturo Madrid characterized in his 2010 keynote speech: their America, our America. And we are the other one. So this presentation is an attempt to bridge how to address that gap of their America, our America, by sharing intersectional methodological lessons learned and advancing our understanding of the why. Oh, wait a minute. I can't do all this. Can you help? Yes, can you help? Because otherwise we're wasting time. Yeah. Okay. I think if you just press this arrow, it'll be easier, as I say. But now you're okay, yeah.
You're on the right page?
I'm on the right page. So
Just let me know when
the large aims of the study, I just want to go quickly through this, was to examine the associations among occupational stress, academic organizational factors, coping strategies, and physical and mental health among URM faculty. These questions came essentially from the literature in higher education and from the narrative lived experiences of this group. So we want to look at what it means, what does diversity mean, the experience of discrimination, the role of mentoring, the work-family life balance, and coping strategies used. I am not going to go through the study, but there are summaries of the study up here. Goals of today, no, go back. This is a little bit funny, is really to describe the recruitment process engaged to identify hard-to-reach or vulnerable faculty, proffer important insights on concerns of URM faculty in participating in studies, because most studies do not include in the United States URMs, and now I know why. Report the concerns of non-URM faculty regarding inclusion-exclusion, and describe some of the lessons I learned, and discuss the implications of tensions created in this contemporary diversity-driven identity discourses around identity. Now, my understanding, next, and the way I have been taught to conduct research, next, is that we need to have some explicit assumptions. And that was a basic premise of intersectionality that we started actually way back in the 1970s. What is traditional sociology or psychology really measuring, and what do we want to measure? So we start out with very specific historical, explicit assumptions. The first assumption is that historical treatment of groups in the United States have shaped the circumstances, the opportunity, and the life course of African Americans, Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, and Native American Indians. That race, ethnicity, and class and gender are co-constitutive and mutually reinforcing dimensions that also shape the opportunity structure and the experiences in the educational pipeline or the pathways. For this study, we looked at the quality of educational system matters. Access to public educational systems with limited resources and privilege, and the increasingly resegregated conditions of urban majority-minority secondary schools, the racism, underprepared students for college and for the academic pipeline. Stereotypic representations of these groups of populations as inferior permeate the attitudes of school personnel, the media, and academic organizational environments, and contributes to URM being seen as not desiring or able to succeed academically and are presumed incompetent. This book came out after this, but this was an observation that we knew. So for URM faculty, these perceptions are often translated into they are affirmative action babies, and this came out over and over in our study, where they were continuously questioned that they were not there based on merit, but they were there because of some affirmative action hold that they were able to get into. The last one is that institutional factors such as the role of administrators, mentors, and faculty peers contribute to the academic disengagement and stress of URM faculty, dampening their educational expectations, their aspirations. Essentially, this was the best example of this is poor or no mentoring, low expectations, and pushing many of these faculty to do diversity work. The last assumption that is part of this study, or that undergirds it, is that meritocracy, and more recently its intersection with diversity, is a term that masks the historic patterns of racial inequality that have shaped past and current access to and retention of URM faculty and institutions of higher education. What we did was we decided to do a mixed method study, in part because we wanted rigor and we wanted legitimacy. And legitimacy is very important when looking at issues of race, ethnicity, and class in the United States. So a multi-method study. Wait. Okay, go ahead. Okay, next one. So we did a mixed study design, qualitative data. I did 60 interviews and focus groups, 39 in-depth interviews and 21 focus group participants. These were done, the focus groups were done by gender, because we thought there was a lot of sensitive material, and by race and ethnicity that would come from the different groups. So we had African American women, African American men, Puerto Rican women, Puerto Rican men, etc. We got web-based survey data with 616. And part of the interesting part of this was that the emails and phone calls to confirm my authenticity, to check who I was, to verify why this was being done, which I had to answer, all of them. And another important thing was that at the end of the survey, 172 people provided detailed narratives of experiences of racism, predominantly. It was amazing. Next. Now, the recruitment networks were incredible to find these people. It took us more than 8 or 9 months. We used personal contacts. We called friends. We had a faculty advisory board throughout the United States to begin to identify people in research-intensive universities. We used university website searches. Another interesting thing was that white faculty did not want and could not identify African Americans that fit our criteria, or Puerto Ricans or Mexican Americans. They thought that that would be offensive if they asked. The important thing here is, how do you not know? You know, how do you not know a Native American? So, I mean, if they want to be hidden, that's okay, but most of us do have our identity out there. So I cannot tell you the difficulty here. So this is our very labor-intensive recruitment strategies for the online survey sample. We did a lot, again, of going to conferences, of identifying people, giving them cards. Many of them were very, very interested. Next. Okay, keep going. These web-based survey procedures. We went through a firm and everything was very personalized. It was a detailed letter talking about the importance of this, the invisibility of racial and ethnic, of URM faculty in large national data sets. They were able to save, close, and return for up to 60 days, and they got 2 reminder invitations. Next. Now, so essentially we sent out 2,000 emails. Unopened were 1,294. The final eligible respondents were 616. The bottom gives you how many respondents for each group. The Native American, American Indian, The national survey in California, they get about 17. So when I told the director that we had gotten 23, she said, I can't believe that. So again, through Native American networks, through very personal contacts, they contacted colleagues throughout the United States, and those colleagues responded to the survey. So this tells us why many of these individuals do not participate in these surveys. So methods to facilitate qualitative data collection, and these are some of the lessons I learned. The personal referrals was very important. I conducted almost all the interviews. We have another colleague, Dr. Bonnie Dill, whom actually is the co-author in the book on emerging intersections. She did a few, but then she became the first dean of the University of Maryland in RU, the first female Black dean. So she has a big job. Flexibility in coordinating the schedule. This was a massive full-time experience to coordinate my schedule with the schedule of each interviewee. To meet them, I have met people in every place, hotel rooms throughout the United States, coordinated everything. Repeated assurances of confidentiality through email, through phone. I mean, checking with the person who referred them was amazing. And preserving anonymity. So the data as we present it, we use very broad categories for everything. Next. I think the other thing is strategies to increase the richness of lived experience data. We had to allow participants to reveal their entire story without respect to time. One African-American male was 4 hours. I couldn't get rid of him. He had to tell his story. So we allowed whatever time it took. We debriefed afterwards. Really, they had to get themselves together again. I would say that close to 90% of the participants cried within the first 20 minutes. They had never revealed this information to anyone. So we really needed, can I just have a few more minutes to finish? They really needed to break the silence and to really talk about their fears. Let me just let's move more quickly. Yeah, keep going. Next. Okay. I think, so these were some of the concerns of the faculty, anonymity and confidentiality. Some of them couldn't do it and wanted to do it. They thanked me. They said, we really need to do this. Others did it with some resentment because they were always being asked to get hit up for diversity surveys. So many of them did do it. One of the interesting things that came out of this next was the crisis of exclusion, where I almost felt that it was almost hate mail, people really challenging why they weren't included. They were from some type of Latino, they were half Latino. Why was I looking at racial and ethnic minority faculty? So I got about 60 emails really challenging everything I was doing. So I had to stop the survey. The survey was stopped and rewrite the instructions so that I included all racial and ethnic faculty. So I do have about 20% of the faculty is foreign born. The other Hispanic category, which is predominantly from Spain and South America, is about 85% foreign born. So I am separating them out. So the whole issue of identity and who's included and who's excluded became really difficult. Next, there we go. Hypervigilance. So clearly for all these faculty, there was tremendous hypervigilance due to historical and present experience of discrimination in the academy. They were afraid to reveal in any way that they were dissatisfied. I think what we learned is that these are sensitive topics and they require sensitive protocols. Tremendous labor-intensive amount of time. You cannot send graduate students out there to interview these individuals. It is a lack of respect and it's a lack of knowledge about the processes in those communities. The value of mixed quantitative and qualitative methods, I think, is required because it does provide the legitimacy and rigor that we need. And the whole construct of diversity and the it has really contributed, I think, to the erasure of history of racism and structural inequality. And I think that Gemma said something today, and it is very important, that when we include all as part of the diversity, then we're including really the 99%, so that we erase difference, but we're not really including those who are most disadvantaged. They sort of get lost in the pile there. Let me just go to the last slide. So I like this slide because I think that the intersectional research, I think, as Lisa pointed out, really offers tremendous ability to theorize and to look at different things in different ways. It also proffers assumptions and ethical values, as noted by Dr. Hill Collins, of truth-telling that unveil the power relations in higher education. However, I think as intersectional scholars in the academy, we really have a tremendous burden to bear to help these institutions or the state institutions to do what they have to do to change the structures. But to do that, we have to engage in this deeply conservative academic culture that is not imaginative and that really has tremendous resistance to change and to acknowledge the consequences of its historical actions towards other people, particularly these four groups. Thank you.
So we just heard about this notion of belonging in the academy, the challenges, and it's a very rich study taking us through how to do mixed methodology and the challenges around finding samples, interviewing samples. So it's a very, very rich study, particularly for those of us interested in really getting to the heart of what it means, this notion of lived reality. And so I commend you for engaging in what I'm sure was a very difficult study to execute. And now we're going to turn to, sorry, going between computers here, Dr. Lisa Bowleg. And pick this up. And Lisa Bowleg is Professor of Applied Social Psychology in the Department of Psychology at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., in the U.S. She holds a master's in public policy with a concentration in women's studies and a PhD in applied social psychology from George Washington University. She is a qualitative and mixed methods researcher whose work focuses on the social structural context of Black men's HIV risk and protective behaviors, 2, intersectionality, and 3, Black LGB health and resilience. She's a member of the Behavioral and Social Consequences of HIV/AIDS Study Section at the U.S. National Institutes of Health and a recipient of the 2014 Psychology and AIDS Distinguished Leadership Award from the American Sociological Association. Psychological. Trying to do too many things at one time. My sincere apologies. Okay. We welcome Dr. Bowleg.
Okay, good afternoon. I'm so delighted to be here. I know, right? I mean, I worked hard on these visuals, I gotta tell you. I want to begin first thanking Olana and your wonderful team for this invitation. It's such an honor to be here. And I also want to thank all of you in the room. The energy that you've brought over the last 3 days has just been amazing. And so I feel very honored to be here and to talk to you. So, a little bit about my slides. There are going to be some slides where there are going to be lots of text. That's for you, not necessarily for me. I won't be reading them. There will be some select quotes that I will highlight, but I just want to point that out. Okay, so let's start with the title, They're Here. I don't know if you remember this. This is a 1982 horror flick called Poltergeist, which in the interest of full disclosure, I never saw, because I'm a wimp. I'm a wimp when it comes to horror. The closest I've come to poltergeist is my recent conviction that they are the explanation for my lost cell phone in the last month. That's the closest I've gotten. But I thought that this notion of, the little Carol Ann, she's shaking and, receiving the poltergeist was a really sort of interesting metaphor for some of the waters that I'm swimming in these days in terms of intersectionality research. So what I'm going to talk to you about today, so first I'm going to start with sort of positioning myself and where I enter with regard to intersectionality research. Then I'm just going to talk a bit about the methods. Of course, I'm very much interested in methods, but I'm convinced that this is not the right question. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. And then I'm going to give you some tales from the field, my journeys with the National Institutes of Health, and how intersectionality has really become it's becoming mainstreamed, and talk a little bit about what I think is fueling that. And then there's this notion in African American communities that I really love, this notion about coming correct. And what it means is about coming with respect, the way you enter, and I have a sort of work in progress, similar to Dr. Cole's sort of tips about what we need to do to move the field forward in terms of intersectionality research. Okay, so when and where I enter. Of course, the personal is linked to the political and the professional. In my case, Black woman, Caribbean raised. I'm from the Bahamas, which is very much informs privilege. I have privileges that African American women have not gotten because of where I'm from. I am now bi-identified. If you looked at my 2008 article, the one with the lesbian in the title, let's just say things have changed. Things are fluid. Politically, fiercely committed to research that is emancipatory, social justice. And so a lot of my work, I'm talking about racial discrimination, structural context, and really trying to shift the field in really traditional spaces, such as psychology. And professionally, because so much of my disciplinary training informs where I stand and how I see the world. So a background in women's studies, trained in social psychology. I describe myself often as a frustrated psychologist, and when I've said that, people say, well, who isn't? Public health, public policy, HIV prevention. And so this sort of really shapes where I'm standing. So in terms of privilege, I also occupy incredibly privileged spaces. So I'm a full professor, I have tenure. I am funded by the National Institutes of Health. And that has given me access to spaces that I never thought I would be in. Case in point, that sort of informs some of the knowledge that I'm giving to you, is I'm on a study section at NIH, and it's a 4-year commitment. And when they asked me to join, I said, 4 years? I haven't been in relationships that have lasted that long. But it's really sort of given me a seat in the room, in this room of great power. And what I hope that I'm doing there is really that sort of outsider within and shaping intersectionality discourse and sort of stewarding, to use Dr. Cole's term. So, but I'm always very much aware of the need to interrogate and critique research, because research is problematic, and it is not value-free. And I very much am inspired by Professor Tuhiwai Smith, University of New Zealand, who says that for Indigenous people, research is probably one of the dirtiest words imaginable. And so this is something that I'm always interested in, particularly since I do a lot of community-based research. Looking at the problems of consent forms, the drama of honorarium to get research participants paid, the power in them, working in a system where people tell me their most intimate details that they haven't even told their sort of family and friends, but don't necessarily get mine. It's critically important. But I'm also, this is my little tiny bit on what Jean Marichek, who is she's just so incredibly witty. She is a psychologist at Swarthmore College, what she calls methodolatry. So there's sort of fetishism of methods. And that she says that many psychologists swim in the waters of logical positivism and empiricism, realism, and quantification without even knowing they are wet. And this is why I don't want, and it's critically important because certainly we qualitative researchers spend a lot of time talking about epistemology. What justifies your knowledge, right? Whose knowledge? Whose knowledge is privileged? Quantitative researchers, it's a privileged position. They don't have these same conversations, but it very much informs my work and how I see the world. And so in looking at the questions that you posed, so we got questions about how to best capture intersectionality or multi-method, how to use mixed methods and multi-dimensional methods and all that. These are not the questions that I'm interested in anymore. In that 2000 paper when I was really thinking about quantitative methods, because I think these are the wrong questions to ask. I think we need to know about the epistemology of people who are doing research, where they're coming from. And this is where Cho, Crenshaw, and McCall say it so beautifully. This notion, they say that intersectionality is not a theory, but it really is about, yeah, this is it. Yes, that it's not about the methods, but it's about the rigor that how we use those methods. Because when we're talking about methods, all we're talking about is tools. That's all they are. They are tools for data collection, not to be confused with methodology, which is very different, where I'm going next. And also, I have to say, I had the privilege of moderating yesterday's panel on research methods in population health, intersectionality research. Man, I think we are in good shape. I was just really excited. I think in terms of what's going on, in terms of how to use quantitative methods to do intersectionality research, that's evolving, that is going to work itself out. That's not where we need to spend, or not where I want to spend my time. And so I really want to, again, thank all the panelists yesterday. And I also have in here, I have to plug Greta's new paper, Greta Bauer's new paper in Social Science Medicine, March 25th, 2014, just came out, incorporating intersectionality theory into population health research methodology, challenges and the potential to advance health equity. So, what I'm much more concerned with is this business about epistemology, right? And so this is where I jumped ahead earlier. Cho, Crenshaw, and McCall's work is just so wonderful. Because what they're saying is, okay, we're talking about an analytic sensibility, a disposition, how we enter. It's not about the tools. And so they said what makes it an analysis intersectional is not the use of the term intersectionality or where it came from or the citations. I disagree with that. You'll hear more in a bit. Rather, what makes an analysis intersectional, whatever terms it deploys, whatever its iteration, whatever its field or discipline, is an adoption of this intersectional way of thinking about the problem of sameness and difference. So social justice, that's what it's about, and that's what, that's sort of the bar that I'm holding up for the types of research. So in terms of the methods and what you use, quantitative, qualitative mix, I don't care. That does not keep me up at night. This is what keeps me up at night. Being at NIH on these study sections and seeing how often in the last, this is now my 4th year, so I'm sort of at the end of my term, seeing this increase of intersectionality studies that may be using the word intersectional, but they are not from the people in this room. They are from people with immense power, people who have had years and years and millions of dollars of NIH funding, but know that this is the buzz term. And I started to get nervous when I started to see a lot of the work. I'm an HIV prevention researcher. I'm very much interested in the social structural context of HIV risk for African Americans in the US because the rates are they're just horrifying. And so I was seeing a lot of work on Black men who have sex with men, Black gay and Black bisexual men, HIV prevention research, that didn't really get that Black gay men were Black and were dealing with intersections of homophobia, socioeconomic status, and not just the sexual orientation piece. And this became very disturbing. And so I really have to say that I relished the power that I had in that moment to really, no, stop. No, this is not going to go further, because if it's not towards that emancipatory social justice, and then what is the research for? And this is our money. This is federal government money. So I feel I have a stake in this as well. So it's critically important. And I'll also show you a little bit more about the Institutes of Medicine. But I want to let you know who I'm talking about, because these are U.S. agencies. So IOM, very prestigious. Their charter goes back to Abraham Lincoln in 1863, and they describe, this is their definition, independent nonprofit organization that works outside of government to provide unbiased and authoritative advice and so on and so forth. And then the NIH, of course, is sort of the big monster. Something like $30.1 billion, and as you can see here, they're funding, not only researchers in the U.S., but internationally. And they bill themselves as the largest funder of biomedical research in the world. But it's about the money. And what this slide shows you is you'll see that whereas scientific spending, scientific in quotes, and research and development has really been increasing in other countries, in the US and Canada, it's fallen off. And this NIH grant application success rate shows you this sort of precipitous decline. Now, at the National Institutes of Health, they've had a flat budget for the last 10 years. Flat budget. And then with sequestration, they had an automatic 5.5% budget cut, right? And then on top of that, and so they are reasoning that their purchasing power, as they call it, which I think is an interesting for a research institution, has decreased over the last decreased about 25% over the last decade, right? So it is a smaller pot of money, and it's very competitive to get, right? So you have all these researchers who are sort of scrambling, particularly researchers who are on soft money, which means they don't get a grant, they don't have a job. And so this is sort of the context. But this is the other part of the context. So NIH did this study and found out, lo and behold, that black researchers, or let me put it this way, white researchers were twice as likely to get NIH funds than black researchers. I don't have to explain to this group the absence of intersectionality here. They just, it's just, there's no intersection of gender and race, it's just African Americans. And so, there's been a lot of hand-wringing about how do we get more, researchers into the field, and how are they going to deal with what really is an issue of structural inequality, is what we're dealing with. So that's a larger context. So here's what my life looks like. This is just the reviewer critique sheet, and so we meet three times a year. I get something like, my group might get 80 applications. They can range from, they're on average at least 75 to 100 pages, and we have this critique form. And over the last few years, NIH really started to privilege impact. Like, how is this going to change the field? How is this going to move things around? And innovation. They want to know about significance and innovation. And I think this innovation thing is what's driving the influx in all the intersectionality that I'm seeing. Although they're not using that term, and trust me, they are botching it horribly. So innovation. So this is how NIH defines innovation. Does the application challenge and seek to shift current research or clinical concept by utilizing novel theoretical concepts or approaches? So people are coming up with, contorting themselves in all kinds of ways, right, to come up with something innovative. You can't, qualitative research in and of itself is not innovative. But a theoretical framework like intersectionality sure is. And so this is what is driving the research that I'm seeing. So let me show you the problem. So here is Institutes of Medicine, 2011. They do this really groundbreaking book on our health research agenda for LGBT health in the US. And as you can see, there's sort of 4 cross-cutting areas, and oh, look, there's intersectionality. And I was like, wow, this is great. This is really groundbreaking. And then when you look into the book and you see how intersectionality is defined this was not recognizable to me. An examination of the health status of LGBT people in the context of racial, ethnic, socioeconomic, and geographic diversity will provide a more complete understanding. Where's power? Where's inequality? Where is that? And then they had a glossary, and you flip to the back, and this is the definition. Intersectionality, a theory used to analyze how social and cultural categories intertwine. We could be talking about rope. I mean, and when you looked at this citation, this was to a conference paper somewhere that I'd never heard of. This is a problem. And so this takes me to my come and correct checklist. So come and correct, in a lot of my work, when I work with community-based organizations, this come and correct is very important in terms of how I enter the space. I never enter space as Dr. Bowleg or any of that stuff. Having terms, one of my colleagues calls it having time to have the who's your mama talk. You know, it's a long time before you get down to the business of what you're there for. But I mean, it's very, it's really about respect. And so what I'm looking for in this checklist in progress is for researchers who are submitting sort of and I'm talking about sort of mainstream federally funded research, right? The research, you want the government's money, the people's money, to do work that you say is going to advance their health. I want you to come correct with that. And so here are some things that I'm thinking about. What would be on this list? Do you, the reviewer, know what they're talking about? Do they know? Is it because I'm reading this stuff and I'm thinking, there's a word here, might be an intersection here, it might be a race here and a this here, and I put it all together. I'm like, oh, I think they're trying to say intersectionality. Is it theoretically coherent? Which Liz also had in her slide. We didn't even talk about, but does it have any resonance with intersectionality as we talk about it? Despite all of the challenges and the tensions. Is there this intersectionality-related sensibility that Cho and Crenshaw and McCall are talking about? Is social structural context in there? It's gotta be in there. It's about the macro and the micro. That's the magic of it, as far as I'm concerned. Is the individual the only unit of analysis? This is one of the things that frustrates me to no end about the discipline of psychology. It's about HIV risk explained through your self-esteem, your attitudes, and your risk perception in the end. No racial discrimination, no poverty, no incarceration. You cannot talk about black men in the US without talking about incarceration and mass incarceration. I'll stay off that. Reminiscent of what Patricia Hill Collins talked about on Thursday night, does it uphold or is it disrupting or dismantling the status quo? Because if it's not doing that, then we got a problem. We're just giving you a lot of money to do, to get tenure and get promoted, and you're not improving the lives of the people that you say you're there to help. What is the relationship between epistemology, methodology, and methods? I can be dazzled by a structural equation model as much as the next person, but I want to know that you are really coming from a sense of, where you have a sense of different ways of knowledge and how that shapes the methodologies that you're using. And that should follow logically from your methods. I don't want to see the methods cart put before the horse. Are the methods rigorous? This gets back to what Cho, Crenshaw, and McCall talk about whatever your discipline, whatever your tools, just do it in a rigorous fashion. Do your best. Research is never perfect. Historical context, the Black feminist history, it is just so critical that remain. Wherever intersectionality travels, I want to see that. Are there multiple ways of knowledge acknowledged and respected? I always tell my students when I give these presentations on intersectionality, Sojourner Truth's "Ain't I a Woman?" that famous quote that you all know. And she didn't need a regression model. I really see her in 1851 as the original intersectionality theorist. Are there ways that we are acknowledging different ways of knowing? And citations. Citations are important within these sort of traditional academic disciplines. I don't think that we should have lesser standards for this intersectionality project than we do for others. If you are applying and you have put together a rigorous proposal that you are submitting to a funding agency. I don't care who you cite, but have you cited the historical and contemporary intersectionality literature? This is my work in progress, the Come and Correct checklist for intersectionality. I thank you for listening.
It's just my belt. All right, so I'm not going to close this in case we need it. Shifting around. All right, so we thank Dr. Bowleg for that thought-provoking presentation around coming correct. And I think the synergy between, across these different presentations is just, there's something, and I can't quite figure out the name for it, the word for it. So I'm going to use, for a lack of a better term, the energy that it generates, that kind of intellectual energy, and the questions that are posed about how we do research. Why are we engaging in the research that we're doing? What's the purpose of the research? It really cuts across the presentation. So thank you all for really pushing us as we begin to kind of bring together all of the pieces that we've been talking about over the last few days. And so at this point, we do have some time for questions. I am not really going to moderate. I think we have adults who can handle their own questions. And so feel free to come to the mic, come up really close. Those of you who might be at the back, if you want to try to come a little closer if you can, feel free.
Hi. I've thinking about the future of intersectionality. It wasn't discussed in this entire conference except by me in any of the events I attended. Maybe it was in some of the other ones. But I'm wondering if you can say something about what you think about the future of intersectionality when it comes to non-human animals, because that overlaps not just with them, but with the environment, with the workers in slaughterhouses, and with so much. Thanks.
I don't have an answer for that. I mean, that's well beyond my scope of expertise, but this is the exciting part of the future for me. You have the answers, or there are people in this room who will be working on that and struggling with these issues and bringing them to our attention so that when we meet again, and I don't know when we're meeting again, I hope it will be soon, that there will be panels where people are talking about that issue. So, I mean, I feel very optimistic about the future of intersectionality.
Hi, thank you all for your presentations. They were extremely insightful. I had a question for Doctor, I should have checked your name before I got up for the last presentation, I apologize. In regards to the NIH and the checklist that you're working through right now, this was wonderful because this is exactly the checklist I would hope that if I were to do a proposal that someone on the other end would be working through. I'm wondering, what's a hope for other, I guess, members or spaces within the NIH or other type of grant programs that have this much power? What's the chances of them using this type of checklist or hopeful? Because I could imagine when I'm writing a proposal, most often I'm finding myself having to actually take out most of the critique, make it soft, make it vague, make it large, and kind of not critical, basically. And that seems to be what people or these institutions are most comfortable with very often. So what are the chances of this type of amazing checklist being replicated or becoming, I guess, a part of the fabric or infrastructure when we're dealing with so many spaces that are extremely intersectional?
I'm not sure. You know, I mean, again, I am not part of NIH, and so it's a large bureaucratic monster. 27 institutes. Things don't move quickly there, but there are some fabulous program officers with really progressive agendas that move things through. And I also want to say, I critique the research coming into the panels, but in those rooms, so we're in 2 days of reviews, large rooms, say 40 reviewers. The reviewers, at least on my study section, and I'm the behavioral and social health consequences of HIV, they get it. Even the neuroscientists are raising their hands and saying, well, we think an intersectional framework would be good. And I'm like, oh, wow, they got it. That's amazing. And so I think that as people who have not had access to these spaces are, either by knocking down the door or being invited in, and have the room to bring that knowledge, I think that it's promising. But again, I mean, we're talking federal research, so this is not the most progressive as a rule. So I'm very cognizant of this. This is not the road to emancipation. It's an important step, but it's not.
I just want to speak to exactly that too, because. And this is such a micro scale in comparison to $30.1 billion. Sorry, that's a lot. But at the Public Health Agency, in my branch, which is the Health Promotion Chronic Disease Prevention branch, we have just developed a science plan for the branch. And I have just been nominated to the scientific review panel for the branch. So anything that comes through, and this is for internal science projects. So those tend to be sort of below the radar in terms of external tracking, because not all of the stuff that gets done internally is published or circulated externally. But it seems an important step. We do have equity protocols embedded in in our review processes, and I was very keen to hear that I'd been nominated for the panel, because I'll definitely be bringing your come and correct checklist. So thank you for that, Lisa. It's very great.
I think when we talk about NIH, I do have a few concerns about the future of intersectionality, and we talked in some panels. I mean, the co-optation, the use by investigators who do not know the processes, do not acknowledge the history, but who do use the words. So I'm just wondering if we can really reach social justice. I get concerned about, like in my book, and when I look at some of the other work in books that are written by intersectional scholars, that they are out of the mainstream, that they are not being published by major publishers. We're beginning to get more, and I see that Social Science and Medicine, the one you suggested, that there is more of us on review boards, which is exactly what Lisa is talking about, so that we do get more. But in general, I think most of this literature is still outside of the mainstream. So I'm not sure. We're also conflating a lot of these constructs as we do the research. So I don't know what intersectionality is going to look like in the mainstream scholarly world over the next 10 years, because power has a way of disfiguring many of the pathways for social justice, and I think we have to be very vigilant around that. So I don't think I'm as hopeful as Lisa, because as I look at the literature, I don't see our voices really in there. I see a lot of voices with sort of intersectionality, So I think we have to work harder on really getting some type of, maybe Lisa talked about this, and of sense of a strong social justice focus for intersectionality. But in order to do that, we have to be clearer on the assumptions, on the role of power. We should not be doing studies without including power relations. And even throughout the last 2 days, I think Many studies did not include power relations, did not include history, did not include the colonial relationship between indigenous people, racialized people. Even when we look at transnational studies, we're not looking perhaps East Asians who were colonized by the English and then their return to England, or Afro-Caribbeans who were colonized by England. What is that historical power relations? How does that influence their health, their mental health, their stress level, etc.? In the United States, we have a long way to go with our indigenous people. I mean, they are not acknowledged, they are not recognized, they are not visible at all in the national discourse. So that issues of race and ethnicity and socioeconomic status, I mean, the United States still firmly believes in pull yourself up by your bootstraps. We do not have class, we do not, socioeconomic status, we're still debating what's the best indicator. So, so these are some of the issues that concern me about the future of intersectionality. Its applicability across non-humans, is another area, and those who are in that field need to work.
Sorry, that relates to accountability too, like what we're eating. Factory farms have been in the public for 50 years now. So at a social justice conference to be nonchalantly consuming that food.
I know, but something, the other thing I think will tear us apart is if if everybody wants to do everything in just one group. I mean, I think environmental justice, food security, the role of food and nutrition is critical, but that has to have a space. As soon as it does matter, but we are not experts in this. So if we start pulling, then we water down. So,
Putting it all together. We didn't have to eat abuse.
Right. No. Well, you're right. Of course, you're right. That's a very important point. So, but I think, intersectionality, we have to find these places where we can contribute to different areas that require social justice. And of course, when we look at this, one of the things that this conference has brought out to me is that the 1% is very happy up there, but the rest of us are experiencing different forms of inequality and inequity. So how do we begin to sort of pull together groups and areas and fields of interest and subfields to insert intersectionality to begin to address the different issues? Anyway, I just wanted to say that about the future.
Please join me in thanking this wonderful closing panel of our conference. I think it's incredibly hard to sustain a lot of energy and enthusiasm throughout such a long 2 days. And for those of you who are at the opening evening and pre-conference workshops, it's amazing to end on such a high note. So thank you for such a really dynamic and energetic panel. I think Julie was just absolutely right about that. I'm going to be really brief because I know it's the end of the day. I want to thank you all for coming to the conference. I know we have many different choices of how to spend our time, and I really appreciate you coming and spending it with us here. A special thank you to all of our keynote speakers. A special thank you to all of our policy actors who traveled from all parts of Canada. A special thank you to participants who came from all corners of the world, to the volunteers and our conference coordinators, Carvin Lee and Gemma Hunting. One more time, a special thank you to them. A few housekeeping matters. One is that we will be in touch with you about whether you're comfortable to be on a contact list to create a network out of the conference. Some of the materials, including the primers, will be available online on the Institute website. We will endeavor to put together proceedings from the conference that we'll share from you. And I know a number of people are planning some special issues and edited collections to reflect some of the work here at the conference. As a final few words, usually conferences have rapporteurs that really kind of close and say, here's what the definitive kind of conclusion of the conference is. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to just very briefly tell you some of the things I'm going to take away and reflect on, and then I'm going to ask you for 2 minutes to turn to the person next to you and do the same, with the hope that some of that might actually make its way to the next steps board as you walk out, so that we don't lose some of the thinking and momentum and energy in the room. So this is my list. The things that struck me about what I heard and what I learned, what has been missing from intersectionality discourses and practices, especially when we think about Indigenous knowledges and worldviews and disability, and the flattening of intersectionality and the dangers of that. Working the cracks, regardless of where you are, community, government, academia, understanding the limitations and opportunities in all of these spaces, and understanding that even in all of these spaces, everyone has a role to play. Rethinking false oppositions, as Manalani was talking about, between universality and particularity. And I also want to acknowledge how well she had synthesized already parts of the conference in her talk. Recognizing the dynamic interdependence of our lives and of our work, not shying away from the messiness of intersectionality, the causal complexity of intersectionality, finding new ways of collaborating, grounding ourselves in the for real conversations, forefronting experiential knowledge, being vigilant about centering social justice with our intersectionality work. And we heard so cogently today the stewardship, the come and correct, the doing your work. What is doing your work? Changing the status quo and making a commitment to that, and understanding that it's a long-term project with lots of radical incrementalism. And finally, not losing sight of the fact that this work requires important relationships. Relationships are essential to moving this work forward, for building community, and ensuring that we get the care and support to keep with the project. So thank you very much, but before you go, I want you to turn to somebody that's close to you and share just a couple of thoughts, 2 or 3 things that you take away from the conference, and what you might want to see as future or next steps. Just a couple of minutes, and as soon as you're done, please feel free to leave and put your thoughts down for us. So thank you very much again.